And welcome back to the House Judiciary Committee this Friday afternoon. And we're going to get an update on how Act 40 of 2023, which was S14, on how the work under that act happened over the past several months. And then we're going to have some additional testimony from some other individuals on that. But we're starting with Judge Zone, who is are you like the chair of that?
I am.
Body as well.
Yes.
So if you can introduce yourself in the context of that and all the other contexts.
Tom Zone, I am the chair of the Coordinated Justice Reform Advisory Council, as well as the Chief Superior Judge. And if I have permission to share, I have some slides that I would like to utilize during our discussion today, if that's okay.
Yep, you should have permission. All right, we got it.
Here we go. So the Coordinated Justice Reform Advisory Council, as Chair Lalonde said, is from Act 40 of 2023. The council was created to establish a unified and collaborative state approach to support state and local community-based programs and services that are consistent with our restorative justice policies here in Vermont. And in the legislation, the council was directed to have consultation with state and local partners using data-driven approaches. And the idea was to improve public safety, reduce correctional and criminal justice spending, and to look at reinvesting savings and redirecting funding in strategies that would benefit us in our criminal justice system. The members of the council were set forth statutorily. Willa Farrell, who I understand is testifying this afternoon, myself, Commissioner Demmel. I would be remiss if I did not note that when Commissioner Demmel was out, his slot was filled by Isaac Dano from the Department of Corrections. We have Lindy Boudreau from DCF, Jennifer Pullman from the Center for Crime Victim Services. Monica Weber is our vice chair, and she is our statistics person. Susanna Davis, the executive director of the Office of Racial Equity, and Representative Squirrel and Senator Sears were also part of this. And so it's a broad group, and we were directed statutorily to make recommendations to the Commissioner of Corrections by September 1st for the allocation of not more than $900,000. And that number comes back a little bit in terms of, I'll explain where it comes from. But that money, that number, we were supposed to make recommendations for the upcoming fiscal year for them to look at and for how they were going to spend it. We were also directed to make a report to the legislature, which was timely filed on or before November 15th for additional recommendations. So the September 1st recommendations, we did forward them to Commissioner Demmel. The focus of those recommendations was on the fiscal year 24 budget, of which there were unallocated funds in the amount of $240,952. And also there was the amount of $250,000, which we understood the legislature had intended to be used to fund CJCs. These funds were set forth, they were totaling $899,652, and they were in the budget. The numbers that I just referenced, the 250 and the 490, they're the third bullet point. There was already 108,700 that was to go to DCF. There was 300,000 for the network, and then there was this other 499.52, and that's the area that the council focused on. We recommended that the unallocated funds be allocated to reentry services provided by community organizations following a procurement process, which was consistent with both DOC and state practice. And that was consistent with the memorandum that the network had provided to the council in support of its request for this allocation. The council recommended that these funds for the $250,000 be allocated to the CJCs to address a number of different initiatives. When it says over base allocations, what that means is this was not a total of $250,000 for the CJCs to do their work. but rather the CJCs had their original grants. This was 250,000 above and beyond that to do additional work. And that additional type of initiatives were community recommendations were for community-wide education to enhance Vermonters' understanding of the need for and benefits of restorative justice initiatives and programs in Vermont. This was discussed by the council because it was recognized that oftentimes that gets lost when we look at new initiatives to address the issues that we're facing in the criminal justice system. It also was the idea was to recommend that there be established programs to design and help individuals to address the impediments to success when they get out of the criminal justice system. And where we see this is issues with people who don't have driver's licenses and don't know how to get reinstated, assistance in securing housing and employment, the very basic things that many will take for granted. The idea was if we can put this, if the CJCs can help people address those behaviors and those needs, then what we would hopefully do is see a decrease in the crime that they had otherwise been engaging in. DOC did take action on the recommendations. There was a request for proposal that it issued in early December for women's recovery and reentry services. The major emphasis that it put in its RFP was on recovery, reentry, and stable community-based sober housing. The period closed for that RFP, and the grant is expected to start in March, on or about March 1st, after determinations prior to that time in February. It's not a situation where DOC is saying, well, we're only going to give out one grant. That's it. It is possible that there could be more than one grant that DOC approves to assist in this type of procedure. There was also the November 8th recommendations that we were required to provide, and we forwarded those. And in the focus at that time was on the options for creating a sustainable funding structure to support state programs that further the goals of justice reinvestment and restorative justice practices. And we looked at programs that were supported by fines and fees. This includes diversion and other programs that support crime victim services. And there was a recognition by all on the council that these are important programs that are integral to the criminal justice system. But there was a problem, and that problem was with funding. We identified that there was an instability due to the funding structures. Because what happens is these programs are supported through fines and fees, and they're not consistent. And this instability in the programs then relates to employee retention, as well as fluctuations in appropriations. This directly impacts the programs and the services which they can deliver. And so the council recommended that the legislature enact a session law, and that in that session law, we direct the joint fiscal the legislature direct the joint fiscal office in collaboration with the council and other stakeholders to examine certain things. The reason it was chosen for a session law, there was consultation with Leg Council, and it was advised that that was the most effective way to accomplish what we were trying to accomplish. Specifically, what we were trying to accomplish is to examine the fees and fines collected from state services that support the programs to reduce, to improve public safety, that reduce correctional and criminal justice spending, that decrease crime, delinquencies, and recidivism, and also that support the victims of crime. The intent is to determine which programs are supported by fees and fines so that the council will have necessary information to consider proposing legislation in the future that's not just a session law that would direct us, the offices to assist us and work with us, but rather would move the identified fines and fees to the general fund. And that would then move program support from special funds to general funds and establish in the general fund the money needed to support the programs. The money, essentially what the idea is that what would happen in the future is that instead of the ups and downs of an instability of funds coming in, money coming in through special funds, and the organizations wondering, are we going to be able to function next year? And employees wondering if they're going to have a job. If the money goes down, there's not enough revenue. This would put the burden on the general fund to identify that these are important, necessary organizations, programs, areas to work on, so that the stability comes from the legislative actions to have it as part of the general fund budget, and the instability would hopefully go away. And our thought would be that that would benefit how the programs are, how effective they are. We are not in a position to say whether or not that should go today as far as the money's going over or not, because we need to do a study. And that's precisely what the session law, we gave the specific language. I did not include it in the slides, but it is in our report that was filed. And so our next meeting is on February 12th. And we're going to be starting to discuss going forward and how we're going to proceed. So happy to take any questions.
All right, Barbara.
Thank you for that lovely presentation. I missed if it includes just the CJ. I know you mentioned the network and the CJCs, but I guess I want to be clear on the session law request, which programs for sure are included in that, and does it include crime victim services also?
Our plan is to look at everything.
Okay.
Essentially anything that is funded with special fees or fines, things like that, that is not general fund. Our plan is to look at that.
Awesome. I was hoping you were going to say that, so thank you.
Karen, talk.
Thank you, Judge Zolnay. I really appreciate the PowerPoint and the overview. I feel like it was the big picture of all of it. I have two questions. So you mentioned that gave recommendations for fiscal year 24. And maybe I lost this in following it through. What are the plans for coming up for recommendations for fiscal year 25?
At our meeting on the 12th, what we'll start to do is discuss the same process we did last year. And the big difference will be we'll have more time this year, I think, before that September 1st, the budget, before the September 1st recommendations to the Department of Corrections. So we'll be meeting on the 12th. My thought is that even though we don't have a session law yet, our plan will be to, I think the old expression is better to ask for forgiveness sometimes than permission. So we'll start trying to move ahead a little bit in the hopes that we're going to get that, and try to start lining up things, planning that when we get that session law and when things happen, we'll be able to move forward on that. But we'll be getting information from the Department of Corrections as to what's happened in the past this year with the monies and what they might recommend for going forward. Last year, when we started, what we did was we had a presentation from the Department of Corrections to essentially explain the funding structures as well as the available monies, where monies were already going. And that helped guide us to look at where we were going to be making recommendations in the future. It was mentioned by one or more members of the council that although it was giving guidance, it didn't limit us. In other words, it wasn't, oh, DOC usually does this or is doing this, therefore we can only look at that. We view it that we have a very wide open ability to look at everything. And so we're going to hear from DOC and start taking steps down the road and listen to the stakeholders as to ideas they may have for what might be good things for us to study and look at in terms of recommendations.
Okay. And I apologize, maybe I'm getting confused too, because I appreciate the process for it. I guess I think one of the goals was to help give stability with the funding and kind of knowing what to expect. So it is the piece of if you're giving recommendations for fiscal year 25, but not till September, we start the budget in July though, right? So it's not being ahead. Can you help me understand that?
The monies, as the way it had worked this year and the process as we see it, is the monies are if you will, there. And the monies come from monies that were allocated to the Department of Corrections. So what we're saying is out of these monies that you're expected to have, that you're expected to get for fiscal year 25, here's how we think you should use them. It's not go ask for these additional funds or ask for these monies, but we are starting on the base point that you're going to have about $900,000 Isaac Dano, I know, has put together some presentations where he can explain where that money and how that's calculated as far as that those funds being available with the savings and such from justice reinvestment. But our position is the money's there. We want to tell you how to use it. Because we don't have to go back and say, oh, we need to ask for this extra money. Does that make sense?
It does. And I think maybe it's just for me, is different than how I kind of saw it. And maybe it is then that, because if entities are hoping to have some more sustainability of what the plan is for that justice reinvestment money, sounds like they'll get it. It just might not be until after you meet in September, after the budget year starts.
But one of the things that's important to keep in mind is that this is not affecting the CJC's base grants. That's separate. So this is something extra.
Yeah.
And in terms of the stability that we identified, that talks about those other issues in terms of each year, the concern that you have about that predictability, that's exactly why we want to study that, so that they don't have that type of instability.
Okay, so it's two things.
Yes.
The other, well, maybe it's two questions. I'm curious, this was a new group that was formed. If you have any thoughts of like how effective was it? Did this seem to work? It seems like there's momentum and energy to continue, so that's great. Are there any tweaks or anything that we need to do in going forward, or is it just let things go?
That's actually a question that I would be able to better answer after February 12th, because that's one of the agenda items I was going to have. We have been through the first round of 2 reports. We have seen how the Commissioner of Corrections has sent out the RFPs as we were suggesting, and we will be in a much better position to assess, is what we did it work? Is there a better way to do it this next session? And so I'd be in a much better position to answer that after that meeting as to what the rest of the the council thinks.
Thank you. Thank you for your leadership of this council.
Thank you.
So we're going to have you next, I think, so you can weigh in on this as well. So any other questions though? And then hold that, Trevor, and you can comment on what Judge Zoney just said, because we're going to have you next, like I say. But Barbara, go ahead.
Did corrections by chance say how many people submitted? Or did?
I did not get that information this morning.
Okay,
No.
but it sounds like it wasn't. You probably would have heard if it was, oh gosh, we didn't get many or something.
I believe there were, because I had that they're evaluating. I spoke with Isaac this morning, and I understand that they are doing an evaluation. So if they didn't have any, he did not make any statements to me that indicated there was frustration or dissatisfaction on what they got so far, but I don't know how deep they are into the process.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Judge Zoney? Not seeing any. Thank you so very much, and have a great weekend. Did you have a question? No. And we'll see you next week.
Look forward to it. Thank you. Have a safe weekend, everyone. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
So Trevor, you want to join us on the hot seat? We go next. Sure. Yes. Absolutely. I'm sorry. Willa, do you have any time constraints? Because I was going to have Trevor just jump in next because he wanted to comment about some of the things we just heard from Judge Zoney.
No, I can wait easily. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
I didn't mean to flip the line.
No.
That's a discussion between representatives.
Cut the line here, but not in the lunchroom.
Which one? Representative Trevor Squirrel, Appropriations Committee, and a member of the council that we're discussing. To that question that the Representative Dolan asked, I just want to point out that in the legislation, in the bill, the act, it does say on or before September 1st. So we can take action before the end of the year. And I would suggest, as a member of the House Appropriations, that we do take action before the end of the year. That way, we can sync up what the council would like to do with members of both appropriations committees, because we can create a tension if we don't do that. Okay, so that's my suggestion as far as that goes. What else can I offer here? One of the things we're talking about is there's a bill that you have in this committee, page 591, which is the bill representing the request of the council to move forward with this issue around fees and fines and the evaluation of fees and fines. Requesting that we work in conjunction with JFO to develop the data and then hopefully move something forward. So that's the bill that's here. I haven't come into this committee to speak to it. It's a fairly straightforward bill, if you will. But I've already been in multiple conversations with JFO around acquiring this data. And so I'm in the process of, I have that data, but I have a number of questions that I need to sit down with JFO to sift through that data, because it's a lot, and put it into a form that's specific to what our needs are, because it does cover some other areas that we're not really interested in. And make sure that I'm clear on what that information is showing me. And I will then submit that to the council on February 12th. So we'll have that conversation in that meeting.
So do you still need that bill?
Well, that would be my next point, that I don't think we need
Okay.
to do anything with that bill. Because I think what the bill is asking to do, we're doing.
Right, okay.
And no one's stopping us from doing it. So I would suggest that you could probably spend your time elsewhere
Okay, well,
in terms of just going through that process.
okay. And
That's my recommendation.
perhaps after February 12th, we'll have something else that we need to do.
Yeah.
And maybe we'll revisit this if you tell us that's necessary.
Yeah, and so that's the situation we find ourselves in. I do want to address another area that we discussed in the council, and that is that right now, the DOC has agreed to give base funding of $900,000 per year for justice reinvestment to activities. And I say it's just, I want to be careful that the base funding is for those activities. It doesn't necessarily specify a particular program. Now, there's an exception to that, because in the money that was allocated last year, some of that was already set aside through the Senate process, which is the Vermont Network, which is the base funding. And I 100% support that funding for the work that they do. My question to the council, and maybe even to this committee to think about, is that even if we assume that 900,000 is the right number, I don't know if that's the right number. Maybe it should be a higher number, right? For just investment too. But I would question whether that money should be allocated to base funding for activities, or rather youth or new ideas, maybe best practices in other states that are using that we haven't tried before. It might work in our environment, and use the council to sort of work through those ideas and maybe some of those thoughts and ideas about those. I mean, if we have base funding needs, then we should treat them as base funding needs appropriately in the right budget line items, and not necessarily in this particular line item. Again, that's an opinion that I have, but it was a conversation that we did also have in the council.
Barbara.
So I've got a couple questions. One is DOC is committed to spending $900,000 on those activities. Does anything preclude them from deciding, because I think, I know this has happened in years past, I could not, without looking back, figure out which program, preclude them from saying, we internally are going to provide these activities. We're not contracting them out. We're not contracting all of them out.
I think everything's possible.
Okay. And I see your point. I mean, it seems like it's important that there be adequate base funding. I like your idea about looking at new best practices, with the caveat that we make sure that we're fully funding what we're asking people to take on, because I know frequently we'll give people a little, and not appropriations, but the state, when they contract with people, will be like, we're gonna give you 50,000 to do this, and you might discover it really is $250,000 to do it, especially with startups. So I just hope that in whatever way we can make sure that when we ask a community partner to do something, we allow them to.
Yeah, but on the flip side of it, I would say that the community partner would be looking at that, saying, I can't do that. for them."
Right, absolutely.
And
Yes,
It's a decision point for them.
yes, absolutely.
Yeah, Karen.
I think this is a question, but appreciating that sounds like the council is taking the two approaches of one, looking at the justice reinvestment, that $900,000 money, but then also taking that additional step to look at stabilizing the revenue that funds all these programs in some ways. So I feel like that is going outside of the initial piece, but I feel like it's barely connected. It sounds like you would agree. Like,
Yeah, I do.
and so I appreciate the piece for base, but I think what the worry probably is like, how is everything going to shake out? But I personally, for me, I feel like it's important just to have time and space for this. So I think it's great that the committee's doing this work.
Right, yeah, and I think to your point, there's certain charges that were in the bill that we felt we just couldn't quite get there if we were doing the right kind of work. It's gonna take time, may take a couple of years to go through that process, so you're right.
Other questions at this point? I don't see any, but I wonder if you, I also wanted you to just address, to the extent you can at this point, given it's still a bill in process, kind of the funding of the pre-charge. Maybe just, it would be helpful for us, to give us a little background on the issue of funding pre-charge, where it's coming from, and what we're trying to do as far as move it to a different path for pre-charge, if that's something you'd like to address. But essentially,
I don't know if I can answer your exact question,
right.
but I understand where you're going.
Yeah, and just to real quickly, we've heard from a number of the stakeholders, and it seems that always be one of the top concerns is funding. And so that I wanted folks to at least understand that we have you at the table, and we're really following and trying to make sure that we're getting that part of it right.
Like many parts of government, certainly the criminal justice area is very under-resourced, maybe more so than a lot of other areas, and some more than others within that criminal justice sector. I think that the process you're going through in 645, where you're sort of rethinking how you're doing things and sort of taking apart and reassembling it and shifting things around. I understand that there are resource needs right now, regardless of that shifting around and changing. But I think it's probably the priority is to have the conversation about what it is you want to accomplish, and what that might look like, and then come back to the question about, well, this is what we need to be doing. And now let's talk about the funding piece of that. And in the case of the pre-charge, it's exactly that, because I think you've got situations where you've got an organization like DOC that's funding the CJCs to do a number of different things. But also suggesting the CJCs move over and work under the auspices of the AG's office for pre-trial. And how we decide appropriators, if you will, in terms of looking at the funding piece of that, how that might work, right? And not knowing, if you take a look at the money that flows to the CJCs, whether that's really broken out by activity, right? So that we can really analyze what's pre-charge and what's post-adjudication and all the other programs and activities that they're doing. So there's a lot of work to be done, and I've had conversations with multiple members of this committee about my involvement in this process. And I will continue to look at that, work with you guys, if I could say that, and try to find a solution to that. And it might not just be shifting resources, it might be adding resources to make that work.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that is, and this, it's just, we'll reiterate, and we had good testimony from Matt Valerio this morning. And he is a proponent of this. I mean, there's going to be an ask for the Defender General's office to provide the representation or counseling that would be included in the bill for individuals going into diversion. But his view, and we agree, and we've heard other testimony that this will help with the processing of cases in court because there'll be fewer with the backlog. So that needs to be kind of weighed in here as well, that there will be savings in the court budget. Not that I'm suggesting shifting from the court budget because they're already under-resourced, but I think certainly this is going to be helpful for overall as far as the funds that are being spent in our criminal justice system. So,
And if I may offer one last comment, the bigger conversation is around public safety in our criminal justice system. And leadership in the legislature is very interested in, it's a high priority. I also know it's a high priority for the administration. I think we disagree a little bit about where the challenges are and how to maybe move forward, but we'll have those conversations and work on that. But there is a commitment to properly resource the justice system in a way that functions. And certainly this piece is part of that system. And I've been asked to work with this committee to help with that piece of that, the resource piece of that. And maybe it doesn't all happen, but we do have commitments to address this issue.
I appreciate that. Thank you. And looks like Coach has a question. Go ahead, Coach. You're on mute if you're talking.
He's on mute if he's not.
And you're on mute. That's a very good point. He's on. You're muted, Coach. Still.
He's gonna keep. I'm gonna try to fix it.
Okay. All right. Kayla's seeing if she can fix this. You could try logging out and logging back in and, or, well, okay, that's what we're doing. I was gonna give another alternative, but that's the one. So, when do you get to dive deep into the budgets of what the state's attorneys and the defenders, you know?
We're starting testimony every hour of the day next week.
Okay.
I've only got one part of the criminal justice system next week. It'll probably be the week after.
So can you let us know, because one of our liaison might.
Oh, yeah, I did that before.
Yeah,
I did
either
that.
Barbara or Ella
Yeah.
sit in, although I think we're gonna have them in here as well, telling us, because part of what that conversation is for us as well is, okay, we're working with appropriations to get those resources. What are you doing? What other things are necessary in legislation? I don't think there's a lot beyond what we're working on, but also tell us your processes and how you're making the court run more efficiently, how you state's attorneys are trying to deal with these misdemeanors that are at least 2 years old, those kind of things.
Yeah.
But it'll be in conjunction with us also being able to advocate for what they're asking on the resource side. So
I'll make sure that we're communicating freely.
yeah, absolutely. No, we definitely have been, and I appreciate that. And Coach, let's try again. Can you get off mute? You might have to type it in a chat. And if you type it in the chat, Kayla can tell us what the question is.
We will trust Kayla.
Oh, no. It says that he's not in this meeting for some reason. So we're having technical difficulties with Coach. I can put an e-help in to get him back up.
Coach, text us the question perhaps?
You can
Yeah, let's do.
text us the question, Coach.
Call in.
But if he's not in the meeting, he's not hearing us.
You're gonna say,
No, well,
Joe's gonna,
I'm writing an email, but I could do that.
Right? Are we like he's watching us on YouTube or something?
okay,
I look like her. Yeah.
hands, hand raised, so. It could have been Twitch, just that way. Anyways. Okay, so I think we're good with you and we'll figure out these technical difficulties and we can certainly.
It's a question to me, we'll comment.
Right. Coach can track you down certainly to ask the question as well. So, and we'll get the answer. So thank you very much.
I am going to excuse myself. I have
Yes.
things like.
I understand completely. I really appreciate your time this afternoon. So,
All right, thanks, everybody.
Willa, if you could weigh in on the S14, Act 40, and what you heard from Judge Zone and how things are going and any improvements that you know of.
Certainly. Good afternoon, Willa Farrell from the Attorney General's office, and I serve as Attorney General Clark's designee on the Coordinated Justice Reform Council. And I just first want to just acknowledge the, I think, really laudable goals of Act 40. I think it's always important having folks from different parts of the system come together and talk collaboratively, especially in trying to take a system sort of a large picture perspective of community-based services, which I think are often not recognized for how valuable they are for individuals' well-being, community well-being, and safety in general. The council has really, as Judge Zone explained, has had two pieces of work as I have seen it. One is advising DOC on the Justice Reinvestment funds. And I will say it has taken me a while to come up to speed and understand the sort of timing and sequence of these funds. And I think that has fed into the second portion of our work, which is around this very broad, have the language here, directive about establish recommendations to establish a sustainable planning and funding structure to administer state and local community-based programs and services and modern data collection systems. Really large, ambitious goal. And I think our council was wise in just focusing this year. We only meet 6 times a year on one aspect, which is the challenge that funding community-based services using fee revenue is problematic. And I think Judge Zone captured that well, the lack of ability for victim services, court diversion, and other community-based programs to plan from one year to the next. And so I'm looking, looking forward to continuing work with the council on that effort. I think when I spoke with Representative Dolan yesterday, she asked for ideas of tweaks and changes. I have some which I will be bringing to the council, but I think I'd rather frankly bring those to the council before sharing them in this group. And I think I will just say, excuse me, one of our directives was to collect input from long list of players and parties. And that soliciting input was an awkward process, I think. Some entities, individual entities, submitted sort of proposals directly to the council. Others funneled them as a sort of coalesced, summarized group of thoughts through members. So it's just, I just wanted to note, it's challenging in a small group in a short amount of time to, I think, do a really effective and thoughtful process of getting stakeholder input. So just to acknowledge that, we've only had 1 year, and I think we're going to learn from what happened in this past year. But it's exciting work, and I'm glad to be part of the council. And I think those are really, I would end there in terms of my thoughts at this stage. But of course, happy to answer questions.
Questions? Karen?
Yes, thank you, Willa, for that. And I can understand why it would be helpful to share with the council first your ideas about feedback and that type of piece. I'm just hoping that after that February 12th meeting, that somebody from the council will let us know if there are things that we should update in the legislation or do to help make it easier. Because I think the goal is to have this be an effective group. So I guess I'll just put that out there. And I appreciate that the council's having that conversation.
I can certainly share that with Judge Zone, but as it sounds like he'll be listening to this later and we'll hear that request.
Other questions for Willa? We're letting you off easy today, Willa. It must be Friday afternoon.
It's Friday afternoon, freezing rain. I hope you all travel safely on your way home. And thank you for the opportunity to come this afternoon.
All right, thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.
So we will let me just ask, first of all, if Jill or Sarah have time constraints of any kind. I'm not. Jill, do you have any time constraints this afternoon?
I do not have any time constraints.
Okay, well, we'll go with the order then. We have Sarah, if you could join us.
All. Thank you for having me. For the record, Sarah Robinson, Deputy Director of the Vermont Network Against Domestic and Sexual Violence. Thank you for having taken this testimony today. When I was thinking about this, I was thinking it's actually not that often that we get to come back and talk about how laws are working. We talk so much with you all as you're developing them and passing them, but we don't always get a chance to check back in. And I'm just coming off a week of a bunch of trainings that are related to Act 11, which you passed last year about restorative justice and domestic violence. And anyway, so just to say that there's a whole life to these laws after they leave this building. And I think that this is one good example of that. So we very much appreciated that the General Assembly in 2023 looked at the Justice Reinvestment funding process and your efforts to bring transparency, predictability, and deliberation to the allocation of Justice Reinvestment dollars. And as with many new laws, we believe that the first year of implementation was imperfect. And I think that you heard a bit from the judge and from Willa Farrell as well, that this is a learning process. There is a short period of time and that there are likely some areas for continued improvement. So what I'd like to do today is just highlight what our observations and experience was and highlight kind of 3 areas that we feel like there's some need for additional improvement in implementation. At this point, we do not have any recommendations about changing the law itself. We think that you all did a good job. It is an ambitious goal, and establishing this council they have an ambitious scope of work, but we feel like it's achievable. And for us, the concerns are more on the implementation side of things. So it really falls into 3 buckets. The first is funding allocations and transparency. As you heard from Representative Squirrel, I just wanted to bring back for you all, he mentioned base funding for the network. And I just wanted to really clarify, that is not going to the Vermont Network Against Domestic and Sexual Violence to support services for victims in communities. That is not what that funding is for. That funding is to support treatment programs for people who use harm in relationships, essentially domestic violence offenders. That was highlighted as a funding priority under Justice Reinvestment 2, and has been a longstanding priority of both chambers of this body over the past several years as you've looked at Justice Reinvestment allocations. So that's kind of aside, that base funding is really aside from the up to $900,000 annually. So that's the bucket that I'd like to talk about. So the charge of the council was to discuss and recommend to DOC how to allocate up to $900,000 that DOC was to make available for justice reinvestment for each subsequent fiscal year. That's what the statute said. So in this case, our understanding is that would be FY25. So this past summer and fall, the council discussed the FY24 allocation that had already been appropriated by the legislature. And the legislature had actually already directed that appropriation in the budget's letter of intent. And I did submit the letter of intent with my testimony today. But the letter of intent indicated that $250,000 was to go to community justice centers and $249,000 and change was to go to women's reentry services. The council in their work to date has not yet discussed the FY25 DOC appropriation of up to $900,000. And it's our understanding that there actually was never a presentation in terms of how much might be available in FY25. And there's no current plan that we're aware of, at least, to understand the amount of justice reinvestment funding available for FY25, nor is there a recommendation on how to proceed in terms of the allocation of that. And so we just don't feel like that is necessarily was the intent of the law. We felt like the intent of the law was to actually get ahead of the budgeting process so that those decisions weren't being made in the legislature, but were instead being made by this council. Now we're kind of in the legislative session and there's an unclear amount of money in FY25 to be used on this and kind of unclear charge in terms to the DOC about how it ought to be used. So that's one concern. The second is about stakeholder engagement and data-driven decision-making. And I think that Willa highlighted this well. But just to say that the Act 40 required that the council consult with state and local partners and use a data-driven approach to improve public safety, reduce correctional and criminal justice spending, and reinvest savings. And when the council was created, it was decided that no community-based stakeholder should be appointed to the council. And part of the rationale in the committee discussions that I remember from last year was concern about those community-based stakeholders being recipients of justice reinvestment funding and not wanting to create some kind of conflict of interest there. In our experience, and I can only speak for the network, we didn't feel like there was any meaningful stakeholder engagement related to funding. There weren't any external or community-based stakeholders that were asked to come in and speak with the council at any of their meetings. And so we ended up submitting a memo on behalf of the network, Vermont Works for Women, Lund, and Mercy Connections, which I also submitted to Kayla, to the council, but it was not asked for. We just happened to be tuning into the meetings and watching. And we also just weren't aware of efforts to think about kind of data-driven or evidence-based approaches to funding. And then the last piece that I wanted to highlight is just the implementation of the legislative and the council's intent. So in the FY24 budget letter of intent, as I highlighted, there was the 250 for the community justice centers, 249 and change for women's reentry. And that recommendation went to the council. Despite that letter of intent, there's been no funding that has been released related to women's reentry services as of yet. So, we're more than halfway kind of through the fiscal year. The council did send a memo to the DOC outlining their recommendations about CJCs and women's reentry. And Judge Zone kind of discussed the text of that memo. As a result, the DOC created a request for proposals for women's reentry programming. However, and unfortunately that RFP it wasn't shared with any providers that provide any services in the women's correctional facility. We found out about it through kind of accidentally with a conversation with DOC staff, found out on a Friday that it closed on a Monday. We asked the DOC to extend the RFP, which they graciously did. But we just didn't feel like there was adequate outreach. We also felt like the RFP itself was very, very, very narrowly tailored and really would make ineligible most reentry providers that are providing a range of services. So while we very much believe that the law itself was well-intentioned, we feel like the council was incredibly well-intentioned and diligent in understanding their charge. We just feel like there's a lot of room for improvement on the implementation side of things. And we very much look forward to being in consultation with the council this upcoming year about their work. But hopeful that next year when we come back, it'll be a slightly different story.
Right, so questions or comments? Or Angela?
Yeah, well, I don't know. I have to, I don't want to ask you to guess at other people's decision-making or motivation. So I don't really know how to phrase the question, but I guess maybe were
You just did.
Not yet. Have you had any opportunities to ask questions about where the breakdown is happening, or just kind of how these misses are happening?
There hasn't really been a mechanism to do that. So I'm hoping that if there is opportunity for community-based stakeholders to provide input to the council in some kind of coordinated fashion, not only, and I'll say as the network, we're resourced to track these meetings and to listen to them, but not all community-based providers are. And so we really often found ourselves in this intermediary role of letting other providers know. And so I do think that a large part of this was a huge charge for this council and just them orienting to what their charge was in the first year. So I feel like we have a lot of, I want to afford a lot of grace and understanding for the large charge that they had in front of them. But I think that there's room to improve.
Thank you. And I should have started with, I'm sorry to hear that. I'm sorry to hear that there were these missed opportunities, and I also appreciate your framing and that belief that grace is really important. Assuming best intentions, as we were discussing earlier, and wanting to know where how things could improve.
Ella and then Bartlett.
Thank you for your testimony, and I presume what you wrote up is
I submitted
accessible online. I am really disappointed to hear what you shared. I also appreciate your sort of humility and presuming that everyone has best intentions, and I concur that people generally have great intentions. Meanwhile, there's $250,000 worth of services not happening, and I'm just trying to keep my breath and heart rate at a normal pace. And can you please discuss what it means for that $250,000 not to have come through at the beginning of the year?
Yes. So we have for several years advocated that justice reinvestment dollars get spent to support reentry services for women. That actually happened briefly a few years ago as a 1-year allocation. One of the things that's really hard about that is that providers are essentially scaling up for 1 year and then scaling back down because the services are then no longer available. So in our experience, we work in the facility every single day, our DIVAS program, and our current contract with the DOC is only within the prison walls. And so we're not funded for any work that happens once people leave. And the same is true for many of the providers that work at the Chittenden Regional Correctional Facility. So often what that means is that there are these great trusting relationships that are developed between service providers and women who are incarcerated. And then when they leave, we don't have the capacity to provide the services to them. And we do that often. We seek other funding, certainly, and we do that often just because that is the mission of our work. But I will say that I think what it results in is a lot of gaps for women as they are leaving that facility in terms of meeting their basic needs, in terms of staying connected with medical and substance use providers, especially in those critical weeks after they're leaving the facility. So we were also hoping that the funds would be released kind of briskly at the beginning of the fiscal year because we would have been able to kind of work in concert with other providers to provide those services over the past 9 months.
Can you give us any scale, like the $250,000 is a lot of several people's salaries, so I mean, what, give us a sense of scale?
In the past, we have divided those funds, when we've received them, divided those funds equally among 4 organizations, the Vermont Network, Vermont Works for Women, Mercy Connections, and Lund. So it's really very little funds, and a lot of those funds go to meeting people's basic needs, like a coat when they're released on a day like today, or getting them a cell phone, or finding them emergency housing. So a lot of that is actually direct support that goes to women directly as they're leaving the facility. So it's funding that can be immediately marshaled, which is excellent, and really make an impact on people's lives. But that's only if we have capacity to do that.
Thanks.
So I wish I'm not sure what we could have done about it, but I wish we had known about, it's shocking to hear this information, but in a way, yeah, I know that this has happened several years. I think this happened with many providers, maybe like 8 or 10 years ago. So there's something, I know the players are different, but there's something systemic about how we treat our community partners that needs to stop. I mean, so I'm wondering, having that RFP come out now, is that are people spending that money, and they must be spending it in this fiscal year, which means whatever they're putting money in for is not going to be replicable next year, because that would have to be doubled. So they have to kind of, right? Like, is that,
I think we're just really unclear, honestly, about what's going to happen with that RFP. And as I mentioned, when I saw it, I was surprised because it was so narrowly tailored with a lot of requirements around like providing housing, like just very narrowly tailored. That as soon as I read it, I thought to myself,
this is
of all the organizations I know, most would be ineligible or would not be receive preference for this funding.
So it may be that there are a few organizations that do provide that will have the upper hand, and will be new providers, right? To possibly, who knows?
Perhaps, yeah.
So part of the problem, it seems, is us not having some better system for these RFPs being posted, right? Like, so I'm curious if we're even following what the state guidelines are, because like, that's awful, like to hear about it like Friday when it's due on Monday. So I don't know, I was trying to see if I could find a copy of the RFP even.
Off the website at this point.
Right, it looks like there's nothing on there. And I don't know if there's an appeal process when it comes out and who's awarded the money. Like, I'm so concerned on so many levels that I'm just trying to think of ways that I think that it may be that in our miscellaneous bill, we may want to have more direction on next year's, like I don't want to have this repeat this is so difficult to hear and try to come up with a solution at the moment, but I'm concerned. I'm also concerned about having a mechanism for stakeholders to give input. And I appreciate that stakeholders felt uncomfortable being on there and feeling like it was a conflict of interest, but this certainly wasn't what any of us had in mind. And originally I was going to say, isn't that great? We should hear back on every bill that we pass, because what an important step. And then it was like, whoa. So I'm aghast, and I feel bad for providers and for clients, like for the people we're trying to serve. And definitely I'm hoping we can put our heads together to think about a way to put belts and suspenders and boots and a hat on this, because we need that.
I definitely feel like there's the willingness of council members to think about this. And so I feel good about that. You know, as like a parent of two small kids, I've been trying to think about, to me, it almost feels like a game of telephone. You know, it's like, here's the bill, and then it gets translated in a certain way, and then it gets translated again to the DOC in a certain way, which gets translated to the RFP. And by the time we get to the end, it feels like something really different from where it started. And so I think that the question is, how can we make sure that the translation every time from one step to the next is consistent?
Right. And in some ways, again, looking sort of at systems and like, is this happening? I gotta say, I heard a nonprofit day from a local agency who was hearing for the first time about funding that just took a drastic turn from so I think sometimes we have to be clearer with state government about what is intended, and so that we can avoid some of the telephone game.
Yes. Yeah, but even when we're clear, it doesn't necessarily.
No, I know.
We think we're clear.
We need the equivalent of violation of conditions of granting or legislating.
Wow, I like that.
Makes me wonder.
I'm just.
Yeah, no, problematic.
Why? One of us wasn't.
So other questions or input on this issue? Oh, Karen?
I think it's just reinforcing what others have said. It sounds like there's appreciation that it was started and going forward, and that it didn't go as planned. To me, though, hearing it sounds like there was some good progress in having these conversations, getting people together. It may be, I do remember the intent was to stay ahead of the budgets. So I feel like that is one piece. I'm curious with the February meeting where it sounds like they're going to be taking feedback. It sounds like maybe you or other stakeholders haven't been invited yet to give feedback into that. I feel like that's something maybe we can check in on, but I wonder too, if hearing this, if you would be willing to share any feedback, knowing that that meeting and discussion is happening. It just seems like that's a missing piece of it. I don't know if that seems appropriate or not, but.
Yeah, absolutely. And this has been actually really helpful, hearing the judge and hearing Representative Squirrel and Willa. I think they all identified like the work that's happened and the work that's to come. And so I definitely think there's opportunity for ongoing engagement. I will say there haven't been times in the agendas of the meeting to date yet to hear any stakeholder input. So, but you know, that's why we submitted a memo directly to them. But hopefully there'll be more opportunities, you know, in the upcoming year.
Questions or input? Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And
Yeah, everyone.
probably be hearing from folks after that next meeting. So,
Mr. Chair.
yes, go ahead, Coach.
Yeah, I had to connect on a different computer. The other one, it didn't seem to matter what I did. It wouldn't work. But just to be very quick and direct.
Sure.
I think that the bill that Trevor has on the wall, let's kind of hold that as a placeholder for adjustments and changes and additions to the reinvestment council's work, because it seems like, if based on what I've been hearing so far, we're going to need to help them with some adjustments. And if they have to be statutory in any way, that would be a good vehicle without cluttering the miscellaneous bill.
Yes. No, I agree with that completely. I did look at it.
Just a thought.
Yeah, no, that's a good thought. And I was looking at it as we were getting some testimony, which I never should do. I can only do one thing at a time. But just to see if it would have a germaneness problem, and it's not entirely clear to me. It does include the Coordinated Justice Reform Advisory Council, so it's possible that we could use that. So I appreciate that. We're thinking the same way, Coach.
Scary, isn't it?
I don't know who should be more frightened, but so we have one more witness and then freedom for some of us. And so we'll go to Jill Evans, and thank you for being here again. So this will be the second week in a row, I think, and then we'll get you back next week, and we'll just start planning on having a weekly meeting with you, Jill. Are you there, Jill? I'm not seeing you if your video, we don't see you if you are there.
Oh.
Now we don't hear you either.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now, but we don't see you. But if your video is not working, you can still proceed.
My video is not working. I apologize. I've been trying to reboot it.
No, that's fine. So I guess we won't be seeing you this week, but we'll be hearing from you this week and probably again next week. So if you can just identify yourself for the record and proceed.
I am Jill Evans. I'm the director of the Essex Community Justice Center, and I sit on the legislative subcommittee of the network of community justice centers across the state of Vermont. Thank you for inviting me. Like Sarah said, it's unusual to be asked to come back and reflect on a bill that was passed in the previous session. And as a community partner on behalf of the network of CJCs across the state, we understood and agreed with the intent of S14, and that was to increase stakeholder input, transparency, and a process for making recommendations for allocating funds from justice reinvestment. I have less of a handle on the data and reporting piece of it that was in the bill. But in terms of those two pieces of the bill, as you've already heard from Sarah, and from a stakeholder perspective, we are very disappointed with both the process of the Coordinated Justice Advisory Council and the outcomes of the process of this past year. And as Sarah noted, hearing from Willa and the judge and about some of the challenges of starting off and implementation and that kind of thing. But we definitely left the last session, left the State House with an understanding that there was going to be $250,000 being given out to the CJCs for FY24. And similar to how the network didn't get the $249,000 that they also had heard they were going to be getting. We did not ever get that $250,000 from the Department of Corrections. We kind of got a runaround going, asking different people questions about where the money was, were we going to be getting it? And ultimately, the last that we heard was from Derek Miodovnik telling us that the money had already been put in our base allocation for FY24. And so there was not an additional $250,000 coming. And it just highlights, I think, the importance of this bill and its attempt to want to make the funding stuff more transparent and a process that has more accountability in it. We currently don't know what our allocation is yet for FY25. We tried even through a public records request to get what our allocations were that were in the budget that the legislature has right now, and we're not able to get it. So the last communication that we got from the Department of Corrections, in addition to the fact that we weren't getting the $250,000, is that all CJCs could potentially be looking at a collective reduction in our allocations of $372,000 for FY25. And they sent each one of us what that meant for each of our CJCs. And the Essex CJC is looking at a potential $27,227 cut in our allocation for FY25, which starts on July 1st. So it is disappointing that there hasn't, the intent of the bill, which we thought was to make recommendations for how the FY25 budget would be impacted by justice reinvestment savings, but that hasn't happened yet, and we're getting into the middle of the session. What else? And then in terms of stakeholder engagement, we were not invited to come to any of the council meetings, which I think we thought would happen as a result of the bill. I'm sort of surprised to hear that people were sending proposals or requests to individual members of the council. I thought it was going to be a more formal kind of transparent process than that. So we never got an invitation to go before the advisory council. We did meet a couple times with a member of the council, Monica Weaver, about data, but I don't know what came of that. And also when I got invited to testify today, I was surprised that we hadn't even gotten a copy of any of the recommendations that they had submitted or that came out of the work that they had done as one of the key stakeholders in this work. So I guess that's all I have to say.
Questions from committee members? Go ahead, Barbara.
So Jill, I'm wondering, just because I know you understand state government, if you have suggestions of how we can be more specific in trying to craft a solution for moving forward in future fiscal years, despite whatever we are able to do for this year, which I guess is another question.
Is that in with regard to Act 40, like tweaks to that bill, or are you just talking more generally?
I was originally thinking about Act 40, but absolutely feel free to, like, I welcome your answer.
Yeah, I don't have anything prepared or anything specific, but I did really appreciate you, Representative Richardson, talking about how you heard from on the nonprofit day. Like, it would be great if there was sort of like a code of ethics for how state government interacts with and partners with community-based organizations. I think it's very uneven and inconsistent across different departments and agencies.
Right.
I know that there are some people who receive funding from the state who are actively asked during the budgeting process what they would like to get in terms of funding. So
Right.
they're asked for their input and are told this is not a guarantee because it has to go through the legislative session, but this is what we've actually put in our budget for you for this next coming fiscal year. Like, I feel like my experience with the Department of Corrections is we get nothing. And so something that addressed how to respectfully and ethically partner with community-based organizations who do a brunt of the work is a good cut in.
And like posting requirements, like the fact that so many people didn't know about the RFP, like that is concerning.
Yeah, go ahead, Ellen.
And it feels like a timeline that says, by this date, an RFP will go out for the following. Here, I mean, just, a bit of a timeline might be, not horribly intrusive on
Right.
process, but make it very clear some of that. And then people know, even if it doesn't get sent directly to them, what day to go look in the state's list of RFPs. Jill, I just want to say thank you for sharing what's going on. I guess I would ask the same question that I asked of Sarah. I would just love to hear a little bit more explicitly how you think this lack of funding that you're expecting for FY24 impacts people. More specifically, I think just any information you can share for the record would be helpful.
Yeah, so the way that justice reinvestment dollars had been treated in the previous fiscal years was that it was divided equally amongst the 17 different community justice centers. So that comes out to about $14,000 per community justice center. My particular agency this year has had a position that's been vacant for a while, so I am not in as much of a crunch as I think other agencies might be who have been fully staffed. But I mean, I think people from the Community Justice Network have testified about this before. When we get flat funding, that's actually a reduction in funding because of cost of living increases and medical benefits going up and that kind of thing. So what it results in is eliminating of some hours of capacity in many situations in the upcoming fiscal year to try to address shortfalls. I think it also speaks to some of the stuff that Sarah talked about with the network, and that's just items that people that are coming out of prison need: phones, clothing, furniture for apartments, that kind of thing that we end up using in our reentry work. And it also puts us in a position of trying to do some fundraising and getting donations and that sort of thing, which is not, we're not a nonprofit. That's not a part of how we would normally function as a part of the municipality, but it becomes a scramble.
And so ultimately, I presume sort of fewer program hours, fewer clients, or it takes longer to support folks through a particular program. There's less activity happening for that 14,000 that's missing in the budget.
Good question.
I'm just trying to confirm.
Okay, all right.
I'm just trying to get more specific, but
Right.
sure, that's fine. Thanks.
No, that's fine. Jill, can you confirm that that was the understanding? I was more of that was a question for Jill, just to confirm that's
Reduction in program hours and numbers of clients being served and that kind of thing.
That was my question.
Yeah.
Or just try to, you didn't say specific amounts, but I'm just trying to confirm that that leads to, you know, having $14,000 less for what sounded like is mostly staffing in your organization leads to fewer clients getting support or fewer program hours.
Right.
Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you. Other questions or input on this with Jill? So when we get some recommendations, hopefully Judge Zone will have, and others will have looked at this, or we'll hear from Sarah, Jill, and other stakeholders. Seems like there's maybe an accountability issue on what the decisions of this body what their decisions are and whether they're actually carried out. So our theme of accountability, apparently. Anything else with any of the witnesses on this particular issue? Anything else, Karen, since this is what we wanted to hear from?
Yeah, no, I think just hearing back. I appreciate the opportunity to hear back on bills that we passed, and especially this one, which I think was trying to address a problem that had been around for a while. And so this was the attempt. And where can we go from here?
Yeah, it usually takes us a little longer because that's kind of what we were doing with DLS this last year, was follow-up work from 4 or 5 years before. So
It's a good habit.
all right, so I can just give a thank you very much, Jill, for your testimony. I appreciate that. And I can give folks a quick update of what we're looking at doing next week. And let's see how good my memory is, because can I borrow my thing up for a second so I can just give people a heads up? Thank you. So planning on Tuesday, going back to the motor vehicle issues with a number of witnesses. And then on Wednesday in the morning, looking at the judicial nominations. Possible that we can get a redraft by Thursday afternoon. And if everybody's on board, maybe we'll even vote that one out on Friday, just to re-exercise our voting abilities. And then we'll be spending quite a bit of time on H645 on Wednesday afternoon, Thursday morning, and maybe Thursday afternoon, but probably actually getting back to retail theft for some of the additional witnesses like Rebecca Turner and Jay Green that we didn't get to, and also possibly Eitan Nazred Longo from RDAP and ACLU as well, and kind of leaving Friday at this point open, just in case we can the judicial nominating, or if we have to do cleanup for all those other various bills. So that's the game plan. And so we can